Whenever Emily thought about her sister over the next few years, and it wasn't often, she reminded herself that she'd done her best. She had spoken her mind to Tony, and she'd offered Sarah sanctuary. Could anyone have done more than that? Sometimes she found that Sarah made an interesting topic of conversation with men. I have a sister whose husband beats her all the time, she would say. Yeah? Really beats her? Really beats her. Been beating her for 20 years. And do you know a funny thing? I know this sounds awful, talking about my own sister, but I think she sort of enjoys it. Enjoys it? Well, maybe she doesn't enjoy it exactly, but she takes it in stride. She believes in marriage, you see. She said to me once, I was a virgin when I got married, and I've been a virgin ever since. Isn't that the damnedest statement you've ever heard? When she talked that way with a man, usually half drunk, usually late at night, she would regret it profoundly afterwards. But it wasn't hard to assuage her guilt by vowing that she wouldn't do it again. Besides, there wasn't time for anxiety. She was busy. Early in 1965, Baldwin Advertising obtained what Hannah Baldwin called a dream account. National Carbon, whose new synthetic fiber Tylenol seemed more almost certain to revolutionize the fabric industry. Think what nylon did, Hannah exulted. The sky's the limit on this thing, and we've lucked in on the ground floor. Emily developed a series of ads introducing the fiber, and Hannah loved them. I think you've got it licked, honey. She said we'll knock their eyes out. But instead, there was a troublesome hitch. I can't imagine what's wrong, Hannah told Emily. National Carbon's legal counsel just called me. He wants you to go in and talk to him about the campaign. He wouldn't say anything on the phone, but he sounded very grim. His name's Dunninger. She found him high in a great steel and glass tower, alone in his carpeted office. He was big and sturdy, with a heavy jaw and a voice that made her want to curl up and ride in his pocket like a kitten. Let me take your coat, Miss Grimes, he said. Sit down. No, come around here and sit beside me. Then we can go over the material together. In general, I think it's fine, he began, and as he talked, she looked beyond the layouts and pages of copy to explore the whole ample surface of his desk. Its only ornament was a photograph of a lovely dark-haired girl, probably his daughter. They probably lived in Connecticut, and when he got home every day, he would play a few fast sets of tennis with her before they went in to shower and change and join Mrs. Dunninger for cocktails in the library. And what would Mrs. Dunninger be like? There's just one point, he was saying. One phrase, and unfortunately it's a phrase that appears over and over in your copy. You say Tylenol has the natural elegance of wool. That could easily be construed as misrepresentation, you see, when we're talking about a synthetic. I'm afraid if we let it go, we'll have the FTC on our necks. I don't get it, Emily said. If I say you have the patience of a saint, it certainly doesn't mean you are one. Ah, he leaned back in his chair, smiling at her. But if I say you have the eyes of a strumpet, there might conceivably be room for doubt. They sat laughing and talking for longer than their business required, and she couldn't help noticing that he seemed to be happily taking stock of her legs and her body and her face. She was 39, but his eyes made her feel much younger. Is that your daughter? She said of the photograph. He looked embarrassed. No, it's my wife. And she couldn't say I'm sorry or anything like that without making it worse. Oh, she said, she's lovely. Then she mumbled that she'd better be going and stood up. I think you'll find natural is the offending word, he said, walking her to the door. If you can get around that, I don't think there'll be any problem. She told him she would do her best, and as the elevator dropped her back to reality, she revised her fantasies. He didn't live in Connecticut. He lived in an East Side penthouse where that beautiful girl pouted and preened in the mirrors all day, waiting for him to come home. Miss Grimes, he said on the telephone a very few days later. Howard Dunninger. I just wondered if you might have lunch with me. Almost the first thing he told her as they sipped wine in what she described to herself as a wonderful French restaurant was that he wasn't really married at all. He and his wife had separated 3 months ago. Well, separated is a euphemism, he said. The fact is, she left me. Not for another man, just because she was tired of me. I imagine she'd been tired of me for some time, and she wanted to see what freedom is like. Well, it's understandable, I suppose. I'm 50, she's 28. When we started living together, I was 42 and she was 20. Isn't it a little romantic to keep her picture on your desk? Pure cowardice, he said. It's been there so long I thought people in the office might think it looked funny if I put it away. Where is she now? California. She wanted to put the greatest possible distance between us, you see. Do you have any children? Only from my first marriage. That was a long time ago. 2 boys. They're grown now. Chewing fresh French bread and salad, glancing around at the well-dressed, sophisticated-looking people at other tables, Emily realized it would be easy to make love with Howard Dunninger this very afternoon. Hannah wouldn't care if she didn't show up at the office, and surely the General Counsel for National Carbon could set his own schedule. They had both outlived the time of trivial responsibilities. What time do you want to get back, Emily? He asked as the waiter set a gleaming little cognac glass beside her coffee. Oh, it doesn't matter. No special time. Good. His thin lips curled into a shape of shyness. I've done so damn much of the talking I've hardly gotten to know you. Tell me about yourself. Well, there's not really much to tell. But there was. Her autobiography, edited and heightened here and there for dramatic effect, seemed impossible to conclude. She was still talking when he guided her out across the blazing sidewalk and into a taxicab, and when the cab let them off at his apartment building. She stopped talking finally in the elevator, not because she was finished, but only because it seemed important to be quiet here. It wasn't a penthouse, and it wasn't nearly as grand as she'd imagined. It was blue and brown and white and smelled of leather. It was almost ordinary, and its floor seemed to tilt at dangerous angles as he went about the courtly preliminaries. Can I get you a drink? Sit down over here? No sooner had he sat close beside her on the sofa than they were all over each other, and the sounds of the city 19 floors below were overwhelmed by the greater sounds of their breathing. When he helped her into the bedroom, it seemed like a long-awaited, well-deserved passage into light and air. Howard Dunninger filled her life. He was as appealing as Jack Flanders with none of Jack's terrible dependency. He seemed to make as few demands on her as Michael Hogan, and when she sought comparisons for the way he made her feel in bed night after night, she had to go all the way back to Lars Erickson. After the first few weeks, they stopped using his apartment. He said he didn't want to be constantly reminded of his wife, and started using hers. That made it easier for her to go to work on time in the morning, and there was another subtler advantage. When she was a guest in his place, there seemed to be a tentative, temporary quality to the thing. When he came to hers, it implied a greater commitment. Or did it? The more she thought about this, the more she realized that the argument might easily be reversed. When he was the visitor, he could always get up and go away. In any case, her apartment became their home. He was shy at first about moving his things in, but soon one of her bureau drawers was packed with his laundered shirts, and there were 3 dark suits and a bright cluster of neckties hanging in the closet. She liked to run her hand down the length of those ties as if they were a heavy silken rope. Howard owned a Buick convertible, which he kept in a garage uptown, and in good weather they took drives into the country. Once, having started out for Vermont on a Friday afternoon, they drove all the way up to Quebec City, where they checked into the Chateau Frontenac, as if it were a motel. And Sunday night, on the long trip home, they drank French champagne out of styrofoam cups. They went back to the theater sometimes and to small drinking places that she'd only read about before. But most evenings they stayed home, as quiet and gentle with each other as people who'd been peacefully married for years. As she often told him, and she knew it might have been wiser not to tell him at all, she had never enjoyed herself so much with anyone. The trouble was that he was still in love with his wife. There, he said once, when she hadn't even known he was looking at her. What you did just then, the way you held your hair back with one hand and bent over the coffee table to pick up that glass, that could have been Linda. I don't see how I can possibly remind you of her, she said. After all, she's a young girl and I'm practically 40. I know, and you really don't look anything alike, except that she's small-breasted too, and you have the same kind of legs. But just once in a while, some of your mannerisms, it's uncanny. Another time, when he'd come home in a sour mood and drunk a lot of wine with dinner, he sat nursing a bourbon and water for a long time, silent, until he began to talk in a way that suggested he would never stop. No, but you have to understand about Linda, he said. It wasn't just that she was my wife. She was all I'd ever wanted in a woman. She was... How can I explain it? You don't have to explain it. Yes, I do. I have to get it straight in my own mind or I'll never get over her. Listen, let me tell you how I met her. Try to understand this, Emily. I was 42 years old, but I felt older. I'd been married and divorced. I'd had what seemed any number of girls. I guess I felt pretty well exhausted. I guess I'd felt I'd pretty well exhausted my possibilities. I was out in East Hampton for a couple weeks and somebody asked me to a party. A lighted swimming pool, Japanese lanterns in the trees, Sinatra records piped out from the house, that kind of thing. A mixed crowd. There were a lot of actors who made television commercials, a couple of children's book illustrators, a couple of writers, a few business types trying to look arty in their burgundy Bermuda shorts. And son of a bitch, Emily, I turned around and there was this creature lying on this white chaise lounge. I'd never seen skin like that, or eyes like that, or lips like that. She was wearing... Are you really going to tell me what she was wearing? Wearing a simple, short black dress. And I took a big drink for courage and went over to her and said, "Hi, are you somebody's wife?" And she looked up at me. She was too shy or, I guess, too reserved to smile, and she... "Oh, Howard, this is silly," Emily said. "You're just going to get yourself all worked up. You really are a terrible romantic." All right, I'll keep it as brief as I can. I don't want to bore you. You're not boring me. It's just that you're... All right, the point is, the very next night she was in my bed, and every other night after that. When we got back to town, she moved all her stuff into my apartment. She was still in college. She went to Barnard, same as you. And when her classes were over every day, she'd hurry down to my place in order to be there when I got home. I can't begin to tell you how sweet that was. I'd go home bracing myself, thinking, no, it's too good to be true. She won't be there. And she always was. I look back on that time, that first year and a half, as the goddamned happiest time of my life. He was up and walking the floor now with his drink in his hand, and Emily knew better than to interrupt him. Then we got married, and I guess that did take the edge off it a little for her, I think, more than for me. I was still, well, I hate to keep saying happy, but that's the only word for it. Proud, too. Enormously proud. I'd take her places, people would congratulate me, and I'd remember I'd say, I don't believe her. I don't believe any of this yet. Then, of course, after a while, I did start to believe her. I started taking her for granted in ways that nobody should ever take anybody for granted. In the early years, she used to say I never bored her, and I took it as a great compliment. But I don't remember her ever saying that toward the end. I'd probably begun to bore the hell out of her with my vanity and posturings and my self-pity. And I think that's when she started getting restless, along about the time I started boring her. God damn it, Emily, how can I make you understand how nice she was? It's a thing that can't be described. Tender, loving, and at the same time, she was tough. I don't mean tough in any pejorative sense, I mean resilient, courageous. She had a wholly unsentimental way of looking at the world. Intelligent. Jesus, it was almost frightening sometimes how she'd go straight to the heart of some elusive, complicated thing with an intuitive insight. She was funny, too. Oh, she didn't just sit around getting off paralyzing one-liners. It's just that she had a very sharp eye for the absurdity behind anything pretentious. She was a great companion. Why do I keep saying was? It's not as if she were dead. She was a great companion for me, and now she'll be a great companion for some other man. Or men. I imagine she'll try out quite a few men before she settles down again. He sank heavily into an armchair, closing his eyes, and began massaging the thin bridge of his nose with thumb and forefinger. And sometimes now when I think of her in that particular context, he said in a flat, almost dead voice, when I picture her out there with some other man, opening her legs for him, and Howard, I'm not going to let you do this, Emily said, standing up for emphasis. It's maudlin. You're acting like a lovesick little boy, and it's very unbecoming. Besides, it's not very... She wasn't at all sure if she should finish this sentence, but she did. Not very considerate of me. That brought his eyes open, but he closed them again. I thought you and I were friends, he said. I thought the idea was you were supposed to be able to talk freely with a friend. Hasn't it occurred to you that I might be a little jealous? He said. No. As a matter of fact, that hadn't occurred to me. I don't get it. How can you be jealous of something that's in the past? Oh, Howard, come on now. What if I spent whole evenings going over all the wonderful, wonderful qualities of different men I've known? But that question answered itself. She could tell Howard Dunninger anything about any of her men, or all of them, and he wouldn't care. In December of that year, National Carbon assigned him to California for 2 weeks. And I suppose you'll see Linda out there, won't you? She said when he was getting ready to leave. I don't see how, he said. I'll be in Los Angeles. She's way up north of San Francisco. It's a big state. Besides you what? Besides I what nothing. I can't seem to get this goddamn suitcase shut. It was a bad 2 weeks. He called her only twice toward the end, but she survived it. And he really did come home. Then in February, late one night when they were about to go to bed, Sarah called. Emmy, are you alone? Well, no, actually, I'm... Oh, you're not? I see. I was hoping you would be. The rhythm and texture of Sarah's voice evoked a sharp sense of that terrible old house in St. Charles. The mildew, the chill, the ancestors staring from the walls, the smell of garbage in the kitchen. What's the matter, Sarah? Let's put it this way. To quote John Steinbeck, this is the winter of our discontent. I don't think that was original with Steinbeck, baby, Emily said. Has Tony been... That's right. And I've made a decision, Emmy. I'm not staying here anymore. I want to come and stay with you. Well, Sarah, the thing is, I'm afraid that wouldn't be possible. She glanced at Howard, who stood in his bathrobe a few feet away, listening and looking interested. She had told him about her sister. The thing is, I'm not living alone now. Oh, you mean you have a... I see. Well, that does complicate things, but I don't care. I'm leaving anyway. I'll stay in an inexpensive hotel or something. Listen, though, do you think you could help me find a job? I can write advertising copy, too. I've always been able to, turn a phrase. There's a little more to it than that, Emily said. It takes quite a few years to get a job like mine. I really think you'd be better off looking for some other kind of work. What kind? Well, maybe working as a receptionist or something like that. There was a pause. Look, Sarah, are you absolutely sure you want to do this? Emily held the phone and both hands and chewed her lip, trying to figure out her motives. Not very long ago, she had urged her sister to leave home. Now she was urging her to stay. Oh, I don't know, Emmy, Sarah said. I guess I'm not absolutely sure of anything. Everything's so mixed up. Is Tony there? Emily asked. Can I talk to him? And when Tony came on with a drunken-sounding grunt, she felt a fine, swift return of the exhilaration she'd known that night in the hotel room. Listen, Wilson, she began. I want you to leave my sister alone. Is that clear? As her voice rose and flattened out, she understood why she was doing this. She was showing off for Howard. This would prove she wasn't always tender and loving. She could be tough, resilient, courageous. She had a wholly unsentimental way of looking at the world. I want you to keep your big fucking hands to yourself, she said. And if I were a man, I'd come out there tonight and make you wish you never had any hands. Is that clear? Put Sarah back on. There were muffled scraping sounds as if heavy furniture had to be moved before Sarah could come back to the telephone. When she did, it was clear at once that she'd changed her mind. I'm sorry to bother you with all this, Emmy, she said. I probably shouldn't have called in the first place. I'll be all right. No, listen, Emily said, feeling greatly relieved. Call me anytime. Please feel free to call me anytime, and meanwhile, I'll keep an eye on the help wanted ads in the Times, okay? It's just that I don't think you'd be very wise to come right now, is all. No, I don't either. All right, Emmy, thanks. When the phone was back in its cradle, Howard handed her a drink and said, That's terrible. That must have been very hard on you. It's just that there isn't anything I can do, Howard, she said. She wanted him to take her in his arms so she could cry against his shoulder, but he made no move toward her. Well, he said, actually, you could let her have this apartment for a while. We could stay up at my place. I know, that did occur to me, but the point is the apartment's only the beginning. You have no idea how helpless she is. A funny little middle-aged woman with terrible clothes and bad teeth and without a skill to her name. She can't even type except with 2 fingers. Oh, well, I imagine there are things she could do. I might even be able to help her find something at National Carbon. And she'd be around our necks, Emily said with more bitterness than she'd intended. We'd never be free of her for a minute if she were here. I don't want her, Howard. I know it may sound awful, but I don't want her dragging down my life. If you can't understand that, I guess it's just too complicated to explain. Okay, he said, smiling and frowning at the same time. Okay, just take it easy. Several weeks went by before the next call, at about the same time of night, and this time it was Tony who called. He sounded drunk again, and she could hardly hear him because of other slurred male voices in the background, which she realized after a second were the sound of a television turned up too loud. Your sister's in the hospital, Tony's voice said, trying for as neutral a tone as that of a gruff policeman reporting to the victim's next of kin. The hospital? What hospital? Central Islip, the voice said. Then it added, where she belongs. And the silence was filled only with the muffled boom and rumble of the television voices. Oh my God, Howard, Emily said when she'd hung up the phone. She's in Central Islip. What's that? It's where my mother is, the state hospital, the insane asylum. Well, Emily, listen, Howard said gently. Her husband couldn't have just put her there. If she's been committed there, it could only be because some doctor decided to send her in for treatment. This isn't the 19th century. Nobody says insane asylum anymore. It's a modern psychiatric hospital. And you don't know what it is, Howard. I do. I've been out there to see my mother. It's 20 or maybe 50 enormous brick buildings. Even when you're out there, you can't comprehend how big it is because there are so many trees. You walk along those paths thinking, this isn't so bad. And then 2 more buildings come up at you through the trees, and 2 more and 2 more. And they have bars in the windows, and sometimes you can hear a person screaming in there. Don't make a melodrama out of it, Emily, Howard said. The first thing to do was call the hospital and find out what she was admitted for. It's 11 o'clock at night. Besides, they'd never tell me. A strange voice on the phone. They must have rules about that. You'd have to be a doctor to. Or a lawyer, maybe, he said. Sometimes being a lawyer comes in handy. I'll find out what her diagnosis is tomorrow, and I'll tell you tomorrow night, okay? Now come on to bed and stop acting like an actress. When he came home the following night, he said, acute alcoholism. Then he said, oh, come on, Emily, that's not so bad. All she has to do is dry out and they'll let her go. It isn't as if it were paranoid schizophrenia or something like that. That was a Monday. It was Saturday before Emily was free to ride the train out to Central Islip, bringing 2 cartons of cigarettes, one for her sister and one for her mother. On the platform, she nodded to one of the scruffy-looking cab drivers who clamored around her. They seemed to make a nice business out of $1 fares to the hospital and back. And then she was in that bewildering maze of trees and buildings. Sarah's building was one of the older ones. It had a turn-of-the-century look, and Emily found her on a heavily screened upstairs veranda, sitting deep in conversation with another woman of about her own age. They both wore printed housecoats and cotton slippers, and the whole of Sarah's scalp was wrapped in something white that looked at first like a turban, the kind that had been stylish in the early 40s but proved to be a bandage. Emmy, she cried, Marianne, I want you to meet my brilliant sister, the one I was just telling you about. Emmy, this is my very best friend, Mary Ann Polchek. And Emily smiled at a faded, frightened little face. Let's sit over here where we can talk, Sarah said, moving slowly as she led Emily to a couple of vacant chairs in the afternoon shadows. Gee, it's nice of you to come all the way out here. Oh, and you've brought cigarettes, too. Aren't you sweet? You mean that lady's your best friend from home? Emily asked when they were settled, or just here? Just here. She's a wonderful person. You really shouldn't have made this long trip, dear. I'll be getting out of here in a couple of weeks. You will? Well, 3 weeks at the most, my doctor says. I just needed a little rest. Actually, all I care about is getting out before the 1st, when Tony Jr. comes home. Did I tell you his medical discharge came through? Tony Jr. had injured his hip in a Jeep accident, which kept him away from Vietnam. The other recent news about him was that he was married to a California girl. I can't wait to see him, Sarah said. He's decided to settle in St. Charles with his family. His family? Well, the girl he married has 2 children, you see. Oh, and what will he do? Go back to work for the garage, I guess? They love him there. I see. Listen, Sarah, tell me about yourself. How are you feeling? Fine. Sarah's smile seemed determined to prove there was nothing wrong, and Emily noticed that her teeth were white. She must have had them repaired and cleaned. One important question had to be asked, in spite of the smile, and Emily asked it. How did you hurt your head? Oh, that was just stupid, Sarah said. All my own fault. One night, I got up in the middle of the night because I couldn't sleep, and I went downstairs to get a glass of milk. And on the way back, I was almost to the top of the stairs when I slipped and fell all the way down. Wasn't that stupid? And Emily felt her own mouth spread in what she guessed might pass for a smile of agreement on how stupid it was. Were you badly hurt? No, it was nothing. Sarah vaguely indicated the head bandage with one hand. This is nothing. It wasn't nothing. They must have had to shave her head before the bandage went on. It was that closely wrapped, and Emily almost said, did they shave your head? But thought better of it. Well, she said instead, it's good to see you looking so well. For a while they just sat smoking, smiling whenever they met each other's eyes to show that everything was all right. Sarah didn't know that Emily knew of the acute alcoholism diagnosis. Emily wondered if there might be any tactful way to bring it up, and decided there wasn't. It became clearer as they sat there that Sarah would keep her troubles to herself from now on. There would be no more confidences now, no more telephone calls, and no more requests for help. Do you think things will be all right when you go home? Emily said. How do you mean? You think you still might want to come to New York? Oh no. Sarah looked embarrassed. That was just silly. I'm sorry I called you that night. I was just, tired and upset. Those things pass. I needed a good rest, that's all. Because I have been following the Help Wanted ads, Emily said, and I have a friend who thinks you might find something at National Carbon. And there's no reason why you couldn't stay at my place for a while until you get settled. Sarah was shaking her head. No, Emmy. All that's past now. Let's just forget it, okay? Okay, except that well, okay. Are you going to visit Pookie while you're here? I thought I would, yes. Do you know how to get to her building? And Emily instantly realized what a foolish question that was. How could Sarah know the location of any other building when she was locked into this one? It doesn't matter, she said quickly. I'll find it. Well, Sarah said, getting slowly to her feet, I guess you'd better be on your way. Thanks so much for coming, dear. It was wonderful to see you. Give my love to Pookie. Out under the trees again, Emily walked a long way before realizing that she couldn't remember whether the man at the door had said 3 buildings down and 4 to the right, or 4 buildings down and 3 to the right. And there was no one else to ask. A sign at one intersection said E4 to E9, which was no help, and another sign beneath it said morgue. In the distance, twin smokestacks rose against the gray sky. It was probably only the power plant. She knew that, but she wondered if it might be a crematory. Excuse me, sir, she said to an old man sitting on a bench. Can you tell me where? Don't mess with me, lady, he said, and then placing his thumb against one nostril, he leaned forward and blew a bright stream of snot out of the other. Don't mess with me. She kept walking, trying not to think of the old man, until a taxicab slowed down at the curb, and the driver stuck his head out and said, Taxi? Yes, she said, thank you. And it really didn't matter. She assured herself as the cab pulled away toward the train station. Old Pookie would only have lain silent with a look of terminal petulance on her face. She would have extended one hand to receive the cigarettes, but wouldn't have smiled, wouldn't have talked, probably wouldn't have given any sign that she knew who Emily was. Back in the city, she waited well over 3 weeks before calling St. Charles to find out if Sarah was home. She did it from the office, late on a weekday morning so that Tony wouldn't be there. Oh, hi, Emmy. Oh, sure, I've been home for days. How's who? I said, how's everything? Everything's fine. Tony Jr.'s here with his wife and her children, so the place is something of a madhouse. She's very nice and very pregnant. They're staying here for a while, and we're helping them find a house of their own. I see. Well, be sure to keep in touch, Sarah. Let me know if there's anything I can, anything I can do. And Sarah did keep in touch, though not by telephone. Sometime later, she sent Emily a letter. The envelope was addressed in the old, pert, debutantish handwriting, but the letter itself was typed, with a good many corrections marked in ballpoint pen. Dear Emmy, I am writing you instead of calling because I want to try out the typewriter Peter gave me for my birthday. It is an Underwood portable second-hand, and it has a few faults here and there, but it types. With a little cleaning and readjustment, I'll be wearing it like a glove in no time. It's a boy, 8 pounds 7 ounces, and he looks just like his grandfather, my husband. This makes my husband very angry because it makes him tend to feel like a grandfather, and he doesn't care for the idea. I have just finished building a bassinet. Never again. I began with a large clothes basket, some foam rubber, some padded plastic-coated fabric, some sheeting, some thumbtacks, and endless yards of blue ribbon. It was a brave beginning, and eventually a week later it reached fruition. Triumphant, but exhausted, I drove it down to Tony Jr.'s house, but nobody was home. That darned thing rode around in my station wagon for 2 days before it finally came to roost. I'm up to my ears in blackberries this week. Our pasture contains a full 1/4 acre of huge berries just screaming to be picked. So far, I have picked, washed, syruped, and frozen 30 pints, and made 20 jars of jelly, and I still can't keep ahead of them. Personally, I hate blackberries. I do this remembering what the man said when asked why he wanted to climb Mount Everest. because it's there. I have not been able to I have not been to see Pookie for two very valid reasons. First, my driving is limited to strictly local stuff, at least until I gain a little more self-confidence and grow a little more hair. And second, because I almost never have the use of a car. Tony drives his T-Bird to Magnum. Eric drives his T-Bird to the motorcycle shop where he works, and Peter drives my station wagon to his summer job in Setauket. Must say goodbye now and beat feet back to the blackberry patch. Take care of yourself. Love, Sarah. What do you make of it? Emily asked Howard when he'd read the letter. What do you mean, make of it? Just a cheerful little letter, that's all. But that's the point, Howard. It's too cheerful. Except for that one reference to growing her hair, you'd think she was the happiest, most contented little housewife in the world. Maybe that's the way she likes to see herself. Well, but the thing is, I know better, and she knows I know better. Oh, come on, Howard said, getting up from his chair to move impatiently around the room. What do you want from her? You want her opening her heart to you every 5 minutes, telling you how many times he's beaten her this month? When she does that, you say you don't want her dragging down your life. You're a funny girl, Emily. And much later that night, as they lay drained of passion in her bed, she hesitantly touched his arm and said, Howard, if I ask you something, will you promise to tell me the truth? Do you really think I'm a funny girl? In the summer of 1967, they spent their vacations at Howard's old place in East Hampton, where he hadn't been since the final year of his marriage. She liked the brightness and the roominess of the sandy, grassy smell of the house. After the city, it was like breathing pure oxygen, and she liked its weathered cedar shingles, which shone almost silver in the sun. The word delightful kept occurring to her. We had a delightful time, she would say to anyone who asked when they got back to New York. She liked the surf and the way Howard would wade out into it and jump with each breaking wave. She liked the way his prick would shrivel up and turn purple and blue from wind and water so that only her lips and tongue tasting salt could restore it to weight. Howard, she said on their final morning, which was Sunday, I was thinking I might call my sister. Maybe we could sort of make a detour and stop off to see her on our way home. Sure, he said, nice idea. But I mean, are you sure you don't mind? It's really way out of our way, and we'll probably just stumble into some dreadful, squalid scene. Christ's sake, Emily, of course I don't mind. I've always wanted to meet your sister. And so she made the call. A man answered, but it wasn't Tony. She's resting now, he said. Can I take a message? Well, no, who's this? Is this Tony Jr.? No, it's Peter. Oh, Peter. Well, this is Emily Grimes. Aunt Emmy, he said, I thought that sounded like your voice. It was arranged that they would stop by between 2 and 3 o'clock that afternoon. You'd better brace yourself, Howard, she said when they found their way into St. Charles at last. This'll be perfectly awful. Don't be silly, he told her. She had hoped Peter might answer the door, then there would be an embrace and a courteous handshake. How do you do, sir? Before they moved laughing into the living room. But instead it was Tony. He opened the door only a few inches and stood ready to slam it, like a man intent on protecting the sanctity of his home. When he saw who it was, he blinked and stepped back, opening it wider, and Emily wondered how she could possibly greet him, after calling him a bastard and a son of a bitch and threatening his life. Hello, Tony, she said. This is Howard Dunninger, Tony Wilson. He moved his mouth a little to mumble that he was pleased to meet Howard and ushered them through the vestibule. Sarah sat curled up on the sofa, the way old Edna Wilson used to sit, smiling vaguely. Emily looked into that smile for at least a second before realizing what was wrong with it. The lower half of Sarah's face was collapsed. Oh, Emmy, she wailed, trying to ineffectually hide her mouth with one hand. I forgot to put my teeth in. That's all right, Emily said. Sit still. But it was clear that Sarah had been sitting still all day. She might not have been able to get up if she'd wanted to. "Come sit beside me, Emmy," she said when the introductions were over. "It's so wonderful to see you." And she took both of Emily's hands in a surprisingly strong grip. Emily found it awkward to sit there, reaching sideways to allow her hands to be squeezed and fondled in her sister's lap. The only thing to do was moving closer until their thighs touched. And when she did that, she came into the zone of a heavy, fruity smell of alcohol. "My very own baby sister," Sarah was saying while Emily tried not to look at her dark, grinning gums. "Do all you people realize this is my very own baby sister?" Tony sat stolidly in a chair across from the sofa, wearing paint-stained dungarees and looking like an exhausted laborer. Beside him, Howard Dunninger smiled uneasily. The only self-assured member of the group was Peter, who had turned into a striking young man. He was dressed in spattered work clothes, too. He and his father had been painting the house before their guests arrived, and Emily liked his looks. He wasn't tall, and he wasn't quite handsome, but he moved around in a graceful way, and there was something humorous and wise about his face. "Have you finished at the seminary yet, Peter?" she asked him. "One more year to go," he said. "It starts next week." "How was your summer?" "Oh, okay, thanks. I was in Africa for a while." "In Africa? Really?" And he held the floor for a few minutes, mercifully saving everyone else from conversational effort, while he described Africa as a sleeping giant, just beginning to stretch. When he said that, he raised and spread both shapely arms, fists clenched in a sleepy stretching motion, and it occurred to Emily that there must be any number of young girls who thought Peter Wilson was a dreamboat. "Oh, Emmy," Sarah said, "my brilliant little baby sister. I love you." "Well," Emily said, "that's nice." And she realized at once, if only because Tony was looking at her narrowly, that it had been the wrong thing to say. "I mean," she amended, "you know, I love you too." "Isn't she marvelous?" Sarah asked the company. "Isn't my little sister marvelous? What do you think, Howie? Is it all right to call you Howie?" "Sure," Howard said kindly. "I think she's marvelous." It had been over a year now since Sarah's head was shaved, but her hair still had a cropped, untidy look, and it was lusterless. The rest of her, beneath that half-collapsed face, was all sag and bloat. She looked a great deal older than her age. Soon the others began to talk among themselves, leaving the sisters alone on the sofa, and Emily used the opportunity to say, "I didn't know you'd lost your teeth, Sarah. When did that happen?" "Oh, I don't know. A couple years ago," Sarah said in the same embarrassed, pointedly offhand way she dismissed her head wound as nothing in Central Islip. And Emily realized too late that it hadn't been a very tactful question. To atone for it, she squeezed the pale hands that were squeezing her own and said, "You're looking very well." "Peter," Sarah called sharply, and Emily thought she might say, "Shape up." But instead she said, "Tell the story about the old man priest you met in Africa." "Never mind that now, Mom," he said. "Oh, please, come on, Peter." "Mom, I'd really rather not, okay? It isn't a story anyway." "Oh, of course it is," she insisted. "When Peter was in Africa, he met this wonderful old priest, and he—" "Mom, will you cut it out?" he said, smiling to show he wasn't really annoyed with her, and only then did she leave him alone. Still smiling, he puckered his lips very slightly as if to blow her a kiss. Then he turned to Howard and said, "What kind of legal work do you do, sir?" A little later in the kitchen door slammed, and a hulking, squint-eyed youth came in, wearing a studded leather jacket and motorcycle boots, looking as if he meant harm to them all. It took Emily a moment to realize that this was Sarah's third son, Eric. He dipped his head politely at Emily and shook hands with Howard. Then he drew his father and brother aside for a long, mumbled conference that seemed to be about the workings of an automobile. And when their business was concluded, he slouched outdoors again. It was a bright September afternoon. Trees stirred in the wind beyond the windows, and mottled shadows moved on the dusty floor. No one could think of anything to talk about. "Anthony," Sarah said quietly, as if reminding her husband of some private duty. "Hmm?" he replied, and went out to the kitchen. When he came back, he carried what looked like a glass of orange juice, but there was nothing festive in his way of bringing it to her. The glass hung from his fingers, close to one thigh of his jeans, and he seemed to sneak it into her waiting hand. She took the first few swallows slowly and solemnly enough to make clear that it contained vodka or gin. "Anyone like some coffee or something?" Tony Wilson asked his guests. "No thanks," Emily said. "Actually, we better be going. It's a long drive." "Well, you can't go," Sarah told her. "You only just got here. I won't let you go." Then, as her drink began to take effect, she brightened with a new idea. "Peter," she said, "will you do me a favor, one little favor?" "What's that?" She paused for dramatic effect. "Get the guitar." He looked mortified. "Oh no, Mom," he said, and one of his hands hanging from his knee as he sat made a little negative gesture to show it was out of the question. "Please, Peter." "No." But Sarah wouldn't take no for an answer. "All you have to do," she explained, "is go out to your car and get it, and bring it back in here and play Where Have All the Flowers Gone?" In the end, it was Tony who broke the deadlock. "He doesn't want to, dear," he told his wife. Then Emily got to her feet, smiling to prove she'd meant it when she'd said that she and Howard had better be going. Sarah, looking bewildered on the sofa, did not get up to wish them goodbye. There were no more letters from Sarah, and no telephone calls. At Christmas time, the Wilsons' card was signed hastily by Tony, rather than in Sarah's jubilant hand, and this was briefly disturbing. "Do you think I ought to call her?" Emily asked Howard. "What for? Just because of the Christmas card?" "No, honey. If she's in any kind of trouble, she'll call you." "Okay, I suppose you're right." And then late one night in May of 1968, 3 months, as Emily figured out later, before Sarah's 47th birthday, the ringing phone brought Emily stumbling out of bed. "Aunt Emily?" "Peter?" "No, it's Tony Jr. "I'm afraid your sister passed away today." And the first thing that occurred to her, even before the news sank in, was that it was just like Tony Jr. to have said passed away instead of died. What did she die of? She inquired after a moment. "She'd been suffering from a liver ailment for a long time," he said huskily. "So it was mostly that, complicated by a fall she took in the house." "I see." And Emily heard her own voice sink to the hushed solemnity with which people receive the news of death in the movies. None of this seemed real. "How's your father taking it?" "Oh, he's holding up pretty well." "Well," she said, give him my love." Howard's car was being repaired, so they had to go out to the funeral on the train. "Change of Jamaica," the conductor told them. All the way to St. Charles, staring through a dirty window at the slowly wheeling suburbs, Emily gave herself over to memories of her sister. Sarah at 20, elegantly dressed in borrowed clothes and complaining that she didn't care about the silly Easter parade. Sarah at 16, with braces on her teeth, bending over the sink each night to wash her sweaters. Sarah at 12. Sarah at 9. At 9 or 10, Sarah had been much the more imaginative of the girls. She could take a 10-cent book of Woolworth paper dolls, cut out the dolls and their tabbed clothing without ever going over the lines, and invest each dressed doll with a personality of its own. She would decide which of the girl dolls was the prettiest and most popular, and if she felt her dress wasn't nice enough, she would design and make a better one, using crayons or watercolor paints. Then she would fold all the other dolls forward at the hips to make them sit down as an audience. She would hold the performer upright, make her tremble very slightly the way real singers do, and have her sing "Welcome, Sweet Springtime" or "Look for the Silver Lining," to both of which she knew all the words. "You okay, Emily?" Howard asked, touching her arm. "Sure," she said, "I'm fine." Young Eric met them at the station, wearing mirror sunglasses and dressed in a cheap dark suit from which his big wrists hung like slabs of meat. "Is Peter here yet?" she asked him. Everybody's here, he said as he steered them expertly through traffic. This was going to be awful. The only thing to do was get through it, get it over with somehow, and try to remember that Howard Dunninger was there with her. He rode alone in the back seat of Eric's car, but by turning her head very slightly, she could see the well-pressed Oxford gray flannel of his trousers, and that was comforting. There isn't going to be a real funeral, Eric said at the wheel. We're just going to have a little service at the graveside. Then they were all walking on fresh grass among tombstones under a blue sky. And it occurred to Emily that the Wilsons must really have been an important family after all, if they had a private burial plot in one of the most crowded sections of Long Island. Sarah's open grave was covered with a gray tarpaulin. Her closed coffin lying on the contraption that would lower it into the earth looked quite small. She had never been very big except in childhood memories. Not far away, one of the newer-looking tombstones read, Edna, beloved wife of Joffrey. And that was the first Emily knew that old Edna had died. It was funny Sarah hadn't told her. She made a mental note to ask Sarah about it after the ceremony before it struck her that she could never ask Sarah about anything again. Very shyly, like a child seeking her father's forgiveness, she put her fingers through Howard's arm. She could almost hear Sarah's voice saying, "It's okay, Emmy, it's okay." To their left, a big, soft-looking man stood weeping, or rather working his lips in an effort at self-control and blinking his red eyes. Close beside him was a matronly young woman with a toddling infant and an older boy and girl clinging to her skirt. It was Tony Jr. with his wife and a baby and stepchildren. The minister was there too, clasping his small prayer book while they waited for the other mourners to arrive. Several car doors slammed in the distance, and soon a cluster of men appeared, walking quickly. Tony was in the middle, in animated conversation with another man. He seemed to be laughing and talking at the same time, and he repeatedly made the same gesture he had used years ago in telling Jack Flanders about the takeoff speed of Magnum jet fighters, knifing the flat of his hand straight ahead from his temple. The man beside him smiled and nodded, and once he cuffed Tony's shoulder with his fist. From their clothes and bearing, starchy and solid, lower middle class, Emily assumed that these other men were some of Tony's co-workers at the Magnum plant. Behind them came Peter and another group, solemn young men of about his own age who looked like graduate students. Tony was still talking when he came up to where Emily and Howard stood. "Straight ahead, right?" he demanded of the man beside him. "No, looking back." He made the hand and temple gesture. "Everything's straight ahead." "Right, Tony," the man said. "That's it." "Oh, I say," Tony said, blinking. "Hello, Emmy." The hollows of his eyes were red and swollen, as if he'd vigorously ground his fists into them for a long time. "Hello, Tony." Then he saw Howard and shook hands with him. "Nice to see you, Mr. Howinger. I say, one of our men went over to your firm last month. I told him I know the legal counsel there might be useful for you. Perhaps you'll run into him. Hell of a nice chap named... Or no, wait, that was Union Carbide." "Well," Howard said, "they're pretty much the same thing." And Tony turned his inflamed eyes on Emily again. He seemed to be trying to tell her something for which he lacked the words. "I say," he said, bringing the flat of his hand up beside one eye. "Straight ahead. No looking back. No looking sideways." The hand shot forward, straight ahead. "Right, Tony," she said. When the ceremony began, the Magnum men and the graduate students stood back at a respectful distance. Peter, whose eyes and mouth looked free of any emotion but concern, led his father off to one side of the grave and held him firmly by the upper arm as if to keep him from falling. As the minister's voice intoned the ecclesiastical words, Tony's jaws fell open, and several strands of spittle clung and trembled between his lips. "Earth to earth," the minister was saying, "ashes to ashes, dust to dust." And he crumbled a handful of dirt on the top of Sarah's coffin to symbolize her burial. Then it was over, and they were all walking out of the cemetery. Peter had turned his father over to the Magnum men. Now he fell into step with Emily and Howard and said, "You're coming back to the house with us for a while, aren't you? Here, we'll go in my car." Except that his hands shook a little on the ignition key and the steering wheel. He seemed wholly in control of himself. "Those younger guys are friends of mine from the seminary," he said as he drove. "I didn't ask them to come. They found out about it and came out on their own." "It always surprises me how kind people are." "Hmm," Emily said. She wanted to say, "How did she die, Peter? Tell me the truth." Instead, she turned her head to watch the bright supermarkets and filling stations slide past. "Peter," she said after a while, "is your grandfather well?" "Oh, he's fine, Aunt Emmy. He wanted to come out today, but he didn't feel up to it. He's been in a nursing home for some time, you see." The old house looked even more gaunt and forbidding than Emily had remembered it. One of Tony Jr.'s stepchildren opened the door for them, giggled, and ran away to hide in the musty living room. The rest of the party was assembled around the dining room table, which was strewn with sandwich makings and with bottles of beer and soda. It was a noisy gathering. "And this guy," one of the Magnum men was saying, punching Tony heartily on the shoulder, "this guy catches one measly little blowfish, and he makes such a big deal out of it, I thought he's going to tip the boat over." Tony, his eyes still swollen, rolled with the punch and a spasm of laughter and raised the can of beer to his lips. "Can I get you something, Aunt Emmy?" Peter asked. "No, thanks." "Well, yes, I'll take a beer if you have enough." "You, sir?" "Nothing for now, thanks," Howard said. "I'm fine." "No, but I'll never forget this one time we went out," the man from Magnum said. Flushed with the success of his first fishing story, he launched into another without seeming to notice that he'd lost most of his audience. "Who all was with us that time, Tony?" "You, me, Fred Slovak, I forget. Anyway, we..." "Anybody else on the liverwurst?" Tony Jr. inquired. He was taking sandwich orders. "You want the regular mustard on that, or the baby shit?" His wife, who had apparently put the baby down for a nap, was trying to wipe spilled Coca-Cola from the dress of a peevish 5-year-old. "Tell me one thing, though," one of the seminary students, a pleased-looking boy with a southern accent, directed a shy smile at Tony Jr. "One thing I don't understand. How come you didn't beat up on your brother more when you were kids?" "Oh, I tried," Tony Jr. said, spreading mayonnaise on rye bread. "I tried plenty of times, but it wasn't easy. I mean, he's little, but he's wiry." "So I says, 'I got $5, the Magnum man was shouting. "I got $5. Says Wilson don't catch nothing all day." "Christ, Marty," Tony said, laughing and shaking his head in happy exasperation. "You'll be telling that story when we're all dead." Peter went to answer the phone. When he came back, he said, "It's for you, Dad." Still glowing in the aftermath of Marty's story, of which the punchline was that he'd caught more blowfish than anyone else in the boat that day, Tony narrowed his eyes over a shot glass of whiskey and said, "Who is it, Pete?" "It's Sergeant Ryan, over at the station." Tony knocked back his whiskey and grimaced at the sweet pain of its taste. "Police," he muttered, getting to his feet. "Damned police think I killed my wife." "Oh, no, Dad, come on," Peter said in a mollifying way as he followed his father out of the room. "You know better than that. I've told you and told you. It's only a routine investigation." Tony's talk with Sergeant Ryan didn't last long. When he rejoined the party, he had another drink. 2 bottles of whiskey were being passed around the table now, and the shouts and laughter went on far into the late afternoon. Dark blue shadows filled the house when Emily got up to make her way to the bathroom. In the hallway, she stumbled and nearly fell. Righting herself, she found she had collided with a small cabinet bearing old copies of Daily News stacked 3 feet high. On the way back, she passed a framed photograph, the picture of Tony and Sarah on Easter Sunday of 1941. It was hanging awry, as if from the impact of some heavy blow that had shattered the wall. Carefully, with unsteady fingers, she reached up and straightened it. Lights were being turned on against the heavily gathering dusk. "No, but what I want to know," the Magnum man was saying to Tony Jr., "what I want to know is what kind of a job you guys can do for me." "The best, Marty," Tony Jr. assured him. "You can ask anybody. We're the best mechanics in this part of Suffolk County." "Because, I mean, from my standpoint of view," Marty persisted, "from my standpoint of view, that's the only consideration." "Ma," one of the children whined. "Hey, Ma, can we go home now?" I say, come and have a drink, Tony said to a hesitant group of seminary students. Don't you chaps ever drink? Thank you, sir, one of them said. A little bourbon and water. Are you all right, Emily? Howard inquired, looking up from his conversation with another of the Magnum men. I'm fine. Can I get you a drink? I've got one, thanks. Through it all, Eric stood leaning alone against the kitchen door jamb, silent and inscrutable behind his mirror sunglasses, like a young security guard hired to keep the party from getting out of hand. Tony Jr.'s wife took the children home without saying goodbye to anyone. Not long after that, the seminary students left, and then all the Magnum men but Marty made their departure. Listen, Tony, Marty said, you gotta eat, right? Let's everybody go grab a steak at Manny's. And in several cars, after some drink-fuddled preliminary bickering about who would ride with whom, the mourners roared down the highway to a floodlit California-style restaurant called Manny Felden's Chop House. It was so dark inside the place that they could scarcely see across the table as they raised their heavy cocktail glasses. Peter was sober. He sat close beside his father as if this ceremony too, like the one in the graveyard, might require his assistance. Marty and Tony Jr. were once again in their deep talk of business, though now it seemed to have taken a philosophical turn. There was no substitute for honest workmanship in any field, Marty was saying, while Tony Jr. nodded slowly and steadily to show he couldn't agree more. I mean any field, whether it's mechanics or carpentry or shoemaking or you name it. Am I right? Emily held her edge of the table firmly in both hands, because it had become the only steady surface in sight. Everything else was shifting and turning. Beside her in the deep upholstery against the wall, and the wall was unsteady too, Howard was putting away enough liquor to suggest that this might be the third or fourth night since she'd known him that he would go to bed drunk. Eric sat close to no one, and he was the only one who ate heartily when the giant steaks arrived. He ate with the rhythmic passion of a starving man, hunched over his plate as if to guarantee that it wouldn't be snatched away. No, but the older I get, Marty was saying, and mind you, I figure I've only got maybe 15 years tops, the older I get, the more I stop and think. I mean, you see these kids today running around with their long hair and their crummy jeans and their crazy ideas, and what did they know? Am I right? I mean, what did they know? In the end, Howard proved sober enough to fish the timetable out of his pocket, study it in the wavering glow of his cigarette lighter, and determine that they had 15 minutes to catch the last train. Keep in touch, Aunt Emmy, Peter said, rising to wish them goodbye, and he shook hands with Howard. Thanks for coming out, sir. Tony struggled out of his chair, swaying. He mumbled something inaudible to Howard, wiped his mouth, and looked undecided about whether to give Emily a kiss on the cheek. Instead, he held her hand for a second, not quite looking her in the eyes. Then he let go, brought his own hand slowly up to his temple and shot it forward. Straight ahead, he said. It took Emily a long time to realize that Sarah was dead. Sometimes, waking up from a dream of childhood filled with Sarah's face and Sarah's voice, she would go and study her own face in the bright bathroom mirror until she found assurance that it was still the face of Sarah's sister and that it didn't look old. Howard, she said once when they were lying in bed waiting for sleep. Do you know something? I really wish you could have known Sarah in the old days before everything went to pieces. She was lovely. He said. Lovely and bright and full of life. And this may sound silly, but I think if you'd known her then, it might have helped you to know me better. Well, I don't know. I think I know you pretty well. No, you don't, she said. You don't really. We hardly ever talk. Are you kidding me? Or are you kidding? We talk all the damn time, Emily. You never want to hear about my childhood or anything. Sure I do. I know all about your childhood. Besides, everybody's childhood is pretty much alike. How can you say that? Only the most obtuse and sensitive person in the world could say a thing like that. Okay, 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 he said sleepily. Tell me a story about your childhood, make it heartbreaking. Ugh. And she rolled away from him. You're impossible. You're a Neanderthal. Mm. Another time when they were coming back from a drive in the country at dusk, she said, How can you be so sure it was cirrhosis, Howard? I'm not sure. I just said it was most likely considering the way she drank. But then there's that fishy business of the fall she took in the house, and the police calling up and Tony saying the police think I killed my wife. I'll bet he did, Howard. I'll bet he flew into a drunken rage and hit her with a chair or something. They didn't arrest him, did they? If they'd had any evidence, they'd have arrested him. Well, but he and the boys could have concealed the evidence. Honey, we've been over all this 100 times. It's just one of those things you'll never know. Life is full of things like that. 3 or 4 old barns went by, and then any number of suburban developments, and then the beginnings of the Bronx. They were all the way to the Henry Hudson Bridge before she said, You're right. Right about what? Life is full of things like that. There were things she would never know about Howard, too. However much she thought There were things she would never know about Howard, too, however much she might love him. Sometimes it seemed that she scarcely knew him at all. Things weren't going very well at work. Hannah Baldwin seldom asked Emily out to lunch anymore. She had taken to having lunch with one of the younger women in Emily's department, and she seldom called her honey. Nor did she often come out of her private office to place one stout, well-clad haunch on the edge of Emily's desk and waste whole hours with idle chatter in the middle of a working day. She had begun to give her what Emily described to Howard as funny looks, speculative, not very friendly looks, and she found things to criticize in the way Emily did her job. This copy's flat, she said once, of something on which Emily had worked for many days. It just lies there. Isn't there some way you can breathe a little life into it? When the name of a Swedish importer came out in print without the umlaut over one of its vowels, Hannah heavily implied that it was all Emily's fault. And when Emily let a National Carbon ad go through production without noticing that the words patent pending did not appear after Tynol, Hannah behaved as if it were a calamity. Have you any idea what the legal implications are in a thing like this? She demanded. Hannah, I'm sure it'll be all right, Emily said. I know the legal counsel for National Carbon. Hannah blinked and squinted. You know him? What do you mean you know him? Emily felt blood in her face. I mean, we're friends. There was a pause. Well, Hannah said at last, it's nice to have friends, but it doesn't have much to do with the business world. That night, Emily told Howard about it at dinner, and he said, Sounds to me like she's going through menopause. Not a hell of a lot you can do about that. He sliced off a piece of steak and chewed it thoroughly before swallowing. Then he said, Why don't you quit the damn job, Emily? You don't have to work. We don't need the money. No, she said quickly. It's not that bad. I'm not ready to do anything like that. But later, standing at the sink to wash the dishes while he fixed himself an after-dinner drink, she felt a powerful urge to cry. She wanted to go to him and weep attractively against his shirt. He had said, We don't need the money, just as if they were married. One evening, a year after Sarah's death, a tired woman's voice identifying itself as Central Islip State Hospital called up to say, We regret to inform you of the death of Esther Grimes. Oh, Emily said, I see. Well, can you tell me what the procedure is? The procedure? I mean, about funeral arrangements. That's entirely up to you, Miss Grimes. I know it's up to me. All I mean is, if you wish a private funeral, we can recommend several funeral homes in this area. Just recommend one, okay? My instructions are to recommend several. Oh, well, okay, wait, let me get a pencil. And as she passed Howard's chair on her way from the phone, she said, My mother's dead. What do you know about that? When her business was concluded, Howard said, Emily, Would you like me to go along with you out there tomorrow? Oh no, she told him. It'll just be an awful little ceremony at the mortuary. I can handle it myself. All three of Pookie's grandsons were waiting under the central islip trees when Emily's taxi pulled up outside the mortuary the next afternoon. They were the only people there. Peter left his brothers and came forward to help her out of the cab, smiling. "Good to see you, Aunt Emmy," he said. He was wearing a clerical collar. He had been ordained. "Normally they send a priest over from the hospital to perform these services," he said, "but I asked if I could do it, and they said okay." "Well, that's fine, Peter," she said. "That's very nice." The dim chapel smelled of dust and varnish. Emily, Eric, and Tony Jr. sat in the front pew, facing the altar where Pookie's closed coffin lay between two candlesticks. Then Peter came in through a side door wearing some kind of Episcopalian stole and began to read aloud from his prayer book. "We brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can take nothing out. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." When it was over, Emily went out to the office and up to a cashier's window where a man gave her an itemized invoice and accepted her check in payment, after asking to see her driver's license. "You may accompany the remains to the crematory," he said, "but I wouldn't recommend it. There's nothing to see." "Thank you," she said, remembering the twin smokestacks on the central islip horizon. "Thank you." The three Wilson boys were waiting for her. "Aunt Emmy," Peter said, "I know my father liked to see you. Can I drive you over there just for a few minutes?" "Well, all right, sure. How about you guys?" But it turned out that both his brothers had to get back to their jobs, and after they'd mumbled goodbye, their cars roared away in different directions. "My father's married again," Peter said as he drove her down a long, straight road. "Did you know that?" No, I didn't." "Best thing in the world for him. He married a very nice lady who owns a restaurant in St. Charles, a widow. They'd been friends for years." "I see. And do they live in the old—" "Oh no, Great Hedges is long gone. He sold it to a developer soon after my mother died. There's nothing out there now but dirt and bulldozers. No, he moved in with his new wife. Her name's Vera, in an apartment over the restaurant. It's very nice, and he's retired from Magnum. Did you know that?" "No." "Well, he was in a bad car accident about 6 months ago, suffered a bad head injury, and broke his shoulder. So he took his retirement early. Now he's just sort of recuperating and taking things easy. I imagine when he's ready to work again, he'll go to partners with Vera in the restaurant business." "I see." After a while, it occurred to her to ask about old Joffrey. "How's your grandfather, Peter?" "Oh, he died, Aunt Emmy. He died last year." "Well, I'm very sorry to hear that." The fields on either side of the road gave way to dense masses of houses and to shopping centers with acres of parked cars. "Tell me about yourself, Peter," she said. "Where are you located now?" "I lucked into a terrific job," he said, glancing briefly away from the wheel. "I'm assistant chaplain at Edwards College up in New Hampshire. Have you heard of Edwards?" "Certainly. I couldn't have asked for a better situation in a first job." He went on. "My boss is a fine man, a fine priest, and we seem to think alike. The work is very challenging and very gratifying. Besides, I like working with young people." She said. "Well, that's fine. Congratulations. What about you, Aunt Emmy?" "Oh, things are pretty much the same with me." There was a long pause. Then, staring meditatively at the road ahead, he said, "You know something? I've always admired you, Aunt Emmy. My mother used to say, 'Emmy's a free spirit.' I didn't know what that meant when I was little, so I asked her once. And she said, 'Emmy doesn't care what anybody thinks. She's her own person and she goes her own way.'" The walls of Emily's throat closed up. When she felt it was safe to speak, she said, "Did she really say that?" "As nearly as I can remember, that's exactly what she said." They were traveling now through suburban streets so thickly populated that he had to keep braking for stoplights. "It's not much farther," he said, "right around this next corner. Here." The restaurant sign promised steak and lobsters and cocktails, but it had a dreary look. The paint was flaking off its white clapboard front, and its windows were too small. It was the kind of place that a hungry man and woman in a car might spend several minutes considering. What do you think? Well, I don't know. It looks sort of awful. Maybe there will be a better place further on. Honey, I've told you there won't be anything else for miles. Oh, well, in that case, sure. What the hell? Peter parked in the weed-grown gravel of its parking lot and led Emily around behind the building to a wooden staircase that led up to a second-story door. Dad, he called, you home? And there was Tony Wilson, looking like an aging, bewildered Laurence Olivier as he opened the flimsy door and let them in. I say, hello, he said. Hello, Emmy. The small apartment had a makeshift look. It reminded Emily of Pookie's old apartment over the garage at Great Hedges, and it contained too much furniture. Two of Tony's ancestors stared from the cluttered walls. The other pictures were the kind that come with the picture frames purchased in a 5 and 10-cent store. Vera came bustling in from the kitchen, all smiles, a vigorous, big-boned woman in her 40s, wearing shorts. I hope you won't think my legs are always this heavy, she said. I have these terrible allergies, and sometimes they make my legs swell up. And she struck her fist against one quivering thigh to indicate the excess flesh. Can you find a place to sit down? Peter moved that box out of the blue chair so she can sit down. Thank you, Emily said. We were so sorry to hear about your mother, Vera said in a lowered voice, sitting beside Tony on a small sofa that Emily recognized from the old house. You only get one mother. Well, she'd been very sick for a long time. I know, my mother went the same way. 5 years in and out of the hospital in constant pain. Cancer of the pancreas. My first husband, too, cancer of the colon. He died in agony. And this one, she nudged Tony heavily in the upper arm. God, what a scare he gave me. Did Peter tell you about the accident? Oh, I forgot to offer you something. Would you care for some coffee or some tea? No, thanks. Neither one. I'm fine. Have a cookie, anyway. They're good. She pointed to a plate of chocolate chip cookies on the coffee table. Peter reached over and took one, which he munched while she went on talking. Anyway, she said, the highway patrol called me at 5:30 in the afternoon, and I got over to the hospital before they started working on him. They had him lying on a stretcher in the emergency room, unconscious, blood all over the place. And I swear to God, I thought he was dead. His brains were spilling out. Okay, Vera, Peter said, around a mouthful of cookie. She turned on him, her eyes round with innocence and indignation. You don't believe me? You don't believe me? I swear to God. I swear to God, Peter, the man's brains were spilling out in his hair. Peter swallowed. Well, he said, at least they managed to patch him up. And he turned to his father. Dad, here's the piece I was telling you about, the one I thought you might like to read. From the inside pocket of his coat, he drew a folded brochure, handsomely printed on rich tan paper with an old English kind of crest and the words Edwards College as part of its heading. What's this? Vera demanded, still bridling over his disbelief of the brains in the hair. A sermon or something? Oh, come on, Vera, Peter said. You know I don't give you sermons. It's just a bulletin my church puts out. Tony said. He pulled a pair of reading glasses from his shirt pocket, put them on, and peered through them at the brochure, blinking several times. That first article was by my boss, Peter explained. You might enjoy reading that too. My own piece is on the inside page. Tony carefully put the brochure away in his shirt pocket, along with his glasses and his pack of cigarettes, and said, Very good, Pete. Oh, this Peter, Vera confided to Emily, isn't he too much? Isn't he going to make some girl happy one of these days? He certainly is. Tony Jr. and I have our problems, she said, and Eric, well, I don't know about Eric, but this Peter, he really is too much. Only you know what, though? They're spoiling him. All those women up at Edwards College, spoiling him rotten. They feed him. They make his bed for him. They take out his laundry for him. Okay, Vera, Peter said. And then he inspected his watch. I guess we'd better be getting started, Aunt Emmy, if we want to make that train. Once during the following winter, Howard had to go to Los Angeles again, the 7th or 8th trip he'd made since she'd known him. I won't need all this heavy stuff, he said when she was helping him to pack. You don't understand how warm it is out there. "Oh," she said, "that's right, I forgot." And she let him do the rest of the packing by himself. She went into the kitchen to make coffee, but changed her mind and fixed herself a drink instead. These departures were always upsetting. She was determined not to ask him if he'd intended to see Linda. The last time she'd asked him that on his third or fourth trip, it had brought on what almost amounted to a fight. Besides, she assured herself as the alcohol warmed her blood, it wasn't really very likely. He and Linda had been separated for almost 6 years now. 6 years, for God's sakes. And though he sometimes still talked about her in the old, infuriating way, it certainly ought to be clear by now that the marriage was dissolved. But that brought up the insidious question that had nagged her from the beginning, threatening time and again to make her fly at him with shrill and redundant demands for an answer. If the marriage was dissolved, why didn't they get a divorce? "What's the deal?" Howard said, smiling in the kitchen. "You drinking alone?" "Sure, I always drink alone when you go on these trips. I'm getting in practice for when you disappear to California for good. Give me a few years and I'll be one of these terrible old ladies you see on the street with 4 shopping bags, picking through trash cans and talking to themselves." "Cut it out, Emily. You mad at me? What are you mad about?" "Of course I'm not mad at you. Would you like a drink?" That particular California trip gave her no cause for worry. He called her 4 times while he was gone, and the 4th time, when he said he was tired, she said, "Listen, Howard, don't go through that awful business of taking a cab home from the airport. I'll drive the car out and meet you." "No, no," he said, "you don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to. It's just a thing I'd like to do." There was a pause while he seemed to think it over. Then he said, "Okay, good. You're a sweetheart, Emily." She wasn't used to driving his big, quiet car, especially at night and in the rain. Its power and fluidity frightened her. She applied the brakes more often than necessary, causing drivers behind her to sound their horns. But she enjoyed the rich, massive feel of it and the way the dark, dark green of its broad hood was pearled with trembling raindrops. Howard looked drawn and exhausted as he emerged from the plane ramp. He looked old. But when he caught sight of her, his face glowed in a way that was almost boyish. "Damn," he said, "it sure is nice to find you waiting here." Less than a year later, he went to California again, and this time his absence was filled with silence and dread. She couldn't even plan to meet him with the car because she wasn't sure which day or night he'd come home, let alone on which flight. All she could do was wait, trying to appease Hannah Baldwin's disgruntlement through the working hours, trying to suppress a keen temptation to drink herself to sleep in the evenings. Once during that time, walking back to the office after lunch, she saw a haggard, petulant woman's face, a face that anyone would have said was aging badly, lined and deeply shadowed eyes, a weak, self-pitying mouth, and found with a shock that it was herself, caught unawares in the reflection of a plate glass window. That night, alone at the bathroom mirror, she tried any number of ways to make the face look better, crinkling its eyes in a subtle smile, and then in a wider smile of pure delight, tightening and loosening its lips to varying degrees, using a hand mirror to gauge the effects of its profile from different angles, experimenting tirelessly with new ways of enhancing its shape through different arrangements of her hair. Then, in front of the full-length mirror in the vestibule, she took off all her clothes and scrutinized her body under bright lights. Her belly had to be sucked flat before it looked right. But having small breasts was almost an advantage now. There wasn't much that age could do to them. Turning away, she peered over her shoulder to confirm the knowledge that her buttocks were underslung and the backs of her thighs wrinkled. But in general, she decided, facing the mirror again, she wasn't bad at all. She paced off a distance of 10 feet until she stood on the living room carpet, and there she went through a series of the steps and positions she had learned in a modern dance class at Barnard. It was good exercise, and it gave her a proudly erotic feeling. The distant mirror showed a slim, lithe girl in effortless motion, until she put a foot wrong and froze into awkwardness. She was breathing hard and beginning to sweat. This was silly. The thing to do was take a shower, But when she walked into the bathroom, the medicine cabinet mirror caught her as cruelly as the window on the street that day. And there it was again, the face of a middle-aged woman in hopeless and terrible need. Howard came home 2 nights after the night she stopped expecting him, and she knew the moment she saw him, if not from the very sound of his key in the lock, that it was all over. "I would have called you," he explained, "but I didn't see any point in waking you up just to say I'd be a little late. How have you been?" "All right. How was your trip?" "Oh, it was quite a trip. Let me get us both a drink and then we'll talk." From the kitchen, over the sounds of ice cubes and glassware, he called, "Actually, Emily, there's quite a lot to talk about." And he came back to her with 2 clicking highballs. He looked guilty. "First of all," he began after the heavy sigh that followed his first few sips, "I don't suppose it's really news to you that I've seen Linda occasionally on some of these trips over the past however long it's been." "No," she said, "that's not really news." "Sometimes I'd finish work a day or 2 ahead of time," he went on, sounding encouraged, "and I'd fly up to San Francisco and we'd have dinner together. Nothing more than that. She'd tell me about how she was doing, and actually she's doing very well. She and another girl have their own business, designing clothes. And I'd just sit there acting sort of like her father. Once or twice I'd ask her if she'd met any nice guys, and then when she'd tell me about men she'd been seeing or dating, I'd feel my heart start to pound like some crazy, I don't know. I'd feel the blood racing all the way down to my fingertips. I'd feel, get to the point, Howard. All right. He drank off nearly all of his bourbon and water, and then he sighed again, as if in relief that the hard part was over. "The point is there wasn't really any national carbon business on this trip," he said. "I did lie to you on that score, Emily, and I'm sorry. I hate lying. I spent the whole time with Linda. She's almost 35 now. Nobody can call her an impressionable kid anymore, and she's decided she wants to come back to me." For weeks and months afterwards, Emily thought of many passionate, well-worded rejoinders she might have made to that statement. At the time, though, all she could muster was the weak, meek little phrase she had hated herself for using since childhood. "I see." It took only a couple days for Howard to move his belongings out of the apartment. He was very apologetic about everything. Only once, when he flicked the heavy silken rope of his neckties out of the closet, was there any kind of a scene. And that turned into such a dreadful, squalid scene. It ended with her falling on her knees to embrace his legs and begging him to stay. That Emily did the best she could to put it out of her mind. There were worse things in the world than being alone. She told herself that every day as she went efficiently about the business of getting ready for work, of enduring her 8 hours in Baldwin advertising, and of conquering the evenings until she could sleep. There was no longer any listing for Michael Hogan in the Manhattan telephone directory, or any listing for his public relations firm. He had always talked of moving to Texas, which was his home. Probably he'd made the move. Ted Banks was still listed at his old address, but when she called him, he explained with what seemed an excessive amount of embarrassment that he was married to a wonderful person. She tried others. It had always seemed that her life was filled with men, but none came through. There was no Flanders John, and when she tried Flanders J on West End Avenue, it turned out to be a woman. For a year, she found an exquisite pain, almost pleasure, in facing the world as if she didn't care. "Look at me," she would say to herself in the middle of a trying day. "Look at me. I'm surviving. I'm coping. I'm in control of all of this." But some days were worse than others, and one afternoon, a few days before her 48th birthday, turned out to be especially bad. She had carried a batch of finished copy and layouts uptown for a client's approval, and on coming back, she was all the way into Hannah Baldwin's office before discovering that she'd left it all in the seat of the taxicab. "Oh my God," Hannah cried, reeling back on the casters of her desk chair as if she'd been shot through the heart. Then she came forward again, placing both elbows on the desk, and held her head with all 10 fingers, messing up her careful hair. "You've got to be kidding," she said. "That was finished copy. That was approved copy. It had the client's signature on it." And Emily stood watching her, realizing at last how much she had always disliked her, knowing this was probably the last time she would ever face this humiliation. "Total, utter carelessness," Hannah was saying. "Any child could have been trusted with a thing like this, and it's so typical of you, Emily. And it isn't as if you hadn't been warned. I'd given you every chance. I've been carrying you. I've been carrying you for years, and I simply can't afford it any longer." "I have several things to tell you, Hannah," Emily said, proud that she was shaking only a little and that her voice came out almost steady. "And the first is that I've worked here too long to be fired. I want to resign as of today." Hannah took her hands away from her disheveled hair and looked up into Emily's eyes for the first time. "Oh, Emily, you are a child. Don't you see I'm trying to do you a favor? If you resign, you'll have nothing. If you let me fire you, you can draw unemployment. Don't you even know that? Were you born yesterday?" On the dole, a woman's story. If you're fired from a job in New York, you can receive unemployment compensation checks for 52 weeks. After that, if you still haven't found work, your only recourse is to go on welfare. There are more than 1.5 million people on welfare in the metropolitan area. I am a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant and a college graduate. I have always earned my living in professional fields, as a librarian, as a journalist, and finally as an advertising copywriter. I am now in my 9th month of unemployment status with nothing but welfare in sight. My employment counselors, public and private, have done their best. They tell me there simply aren't any jobs. Perhaps no one can fully explain this predicament, but at the risk of displaying an easy and all too fashionable self-pity, I will hazard a guess. I am a woman, and I am no longer young. That was as far as Emily's article went. It had been rolled into her typewriter for weeks. Now the paper was curled and sun-bleached and gathering dust. She was in the 11th month of her unemployment status when she began to fear that she might be losing her mind. She had given up the old apartment and moved into a smaller, cheaper place in the West 20s, not far from where Jack Flanders had once lived. Watching the early morning light filter down among the loft buildings across the street, she often thought of Jack Flanders fondling her elbow inside his bathroom, saying, "Sometimes if you play your cards right, you get to meet a nice girl." But that was part of the trouble. She lived in memories all the time. No sight or sound or smell in the whole of New York was free of old associations. Wherever she walked, and sometimes she walked for hours, she found only the past. Hard liquor frightened her, but she drank enough beer to help her sleep in the afternoons. It was a good way to kill time. And it was on waking from one of these naps, sitting on the bed and staring at 4 empty beer cans on the floor, that she had her first intimations of madness. If anyone had asked her what day or month or year it was, she would have to say, "Wait, let me think." And she didn't know whether the gray beyond her windows was dawn or dusk. Worse still, her dreams had been filled with clamorous voices from the past, and now the voices were still talking. She ran for the door to make sure it was locked. Good. Nobody could get in. She was alone and safe in her own private place. And after standing there for a long time with her fist in her mouth, she got the telephone book and fumbled through the New York City of listings until she found a mental health information service. But when she tried to call that number, it rang 11 times with no answer. Then she remembered it was Sunday. She would have to wait. "You ought to get out and meet people, Emily," Grace Talbot often told her. Grace Talbot had worked at Baldwin Advertising too until she found a better job with a bigger agency, and lately had become Emily's only friend. She was wry and hawk-faced and not very likable, but once a week when they met for a restaurant dinner together, she seemed better than nothing. And she was certainly better than nothing now. Emily was halfway through the dialing of her number before she realized she didn't know what to say. She couldn't say, "Grace, I think I'm going crazy," without sounding like a fool. Hello? Hi, Grace, it's Emily. I just called for, no very good reason except to talk. Oh, well, that's nice. How have you been? Oh, okay, I guess, except that Sundays in New York can be pretty awful. Really? God, I love Sundays. I luxuriate in bed for hours with the Times, and with cinnamon toast and cups upon cups of tea. And then in the afternoon, I take a walk in the park. Or sometimes friends drop over, or sometimes I go to a film. It's the only day of the week when I really feel like myself. There was a pause during which Emily regretted having called at all. Then she said, "What'd you do this afternoon?" "Oh, I had a drink with some friends, George and Myra Fox. I've told you about them. He writes blurb copy for paperback books. She's a commercial artist. They're delightful people." "Oh, well, I just thought I'd check in with you and, see what you're up to. You were up to." Everything she said made her hate herself more and more. "I'm sorry if I bothered you in the middle of something or anything like that." And there was another pause. "Emily," Grace Talbot said at last, "you know something? I wish you'd quit kidding me, quit kidding yourself. I know how lonely you are. It's a crime for anybody. It's a crime for anyone to be that lonely. Listen, George and Myra are having a few people over next Friday evening. How about coming along with me?" A party. It would be the first party in longer than she wanted to remember, and Friday was only 5 days away. All week she could think of nothing else. And then Friday was upon her, and all that mattered in the world was getting her clothes and her hair right. She settled on a simple black dress. She couldn't help remembering how Howard Dunninger had said of Linda. She was wearing a simple, short black dress. And a hairstyle that left one lock attractively low over the eye. She looked good. There might easily be a man there, a graying, pleasant-looking man of her own age or older, who would say, "Tell me about yourself, Emily." But it wasn't really a party at all. The 8 or 10 people in the Foxes' living room never left their seats to get up and move around. They all seemed to know each other, and they sat in attitudes of exhaustion, with sardonic faces, sipping at tiny glasses of cheap red wine. There were no unattached men. Emily and Grace, sitting well apart from the main group, were wholly excluded from the talk until Myra Fox bustled over to their rescue, bringing the expectant, listening looks of several other guests in her wake. "Have I told you about Trudy?" she demanded of Grace. "Our neighbor on this floor? She said she might drop in later, so you may meet her, but you really ought to know about her first. She's really something. She's—" And here George Fox, standing with a wine bottle poised for pouring, interrupted his wife in a voice loud enough to address the group. "Trudy runs a woman's masturbation clinic," he said. "Oh, George, it's not a clinic, it's a studio." "A studio, right," George Fox said. "She gets women of all ages, mostly sort of middle-aged, I gather, and she charges quite a hefty fee. The classes meet in her studio and go through a warm-up of modern dance routines, in the nude, of course, and then they get down to the business at hand, you might say. Because Trudy doesn't believe in masturbation as a poor substitute for the real thing, you see. She believes in masturbation as a way of life. Sort of the ultimate in radical feminism. Who needs men?" "I don't believe it," somebody said. "You don't believe it? Stick around. You'll meet her. Ask her yourself. And she likes nothing better than to show visitors through the studio." Trudy did drop in later, or rather she made an entrance. The most startling thing about her was that her head was shaved. She looked like a handsome, totally bald man of 40 or so. And then you noticed her clothes. A man's purple undershirt through which the nipples of her small breast jutted, and a pair of well-bleached blue jeans, whose crotch had been appliqued in the pattern of a big yellow butterfly. She mingled with the company for a while, drawing deeply on a cigarette in a way that emphasized her hollow cheeks and prominent cheekbones. Then, when some of the guests were beginning to leave, she said, "Would anyone care to see my studio?" First came an entrance hall with many coat hooks on its wall and a sign above its archway reading, "Please remove your clothes." "You can ignore that," Trudy said, "but please do take off your shoes." And she led her stockinged visitors into the deeply carpeted main room. On wall was a huge, anatomically perfect drawing of a woman reclining naked with her legs apart, fondling one breast with one hand and applying an electric vibrator to her crotch with the other. On another wall, bathed in the spotlight from the ceiling, was what looked like a sculptured sunburst of many pod-like aluminum shapes. Close up, the pods proved to be precise, life-sized renderings of open vaginas, some considerably larger than others, all with intricately different kinds of outer and inner labia. Emily was inspecting the display when Trudy came up to stand at her shoulder. "These are some of my students," she explained. "A sculptor friend of mine modeled them in wax when they were cast into aluminum." "I see," Emily said. "Well, that's very interesting." The glass of wine was warm and sticky in her fingers, and her spine ached with tiredness. She had a presentiment that if she didn't get out of here at once, Trudy would invite her to enroll in her classes. Trying not to hurry, she excused herself and went back to the entrance hall where her shoes lay, and then back to the Foxes' apartment where several people were agreeing with each other that Trudy's studio was the goddamnedest thing they'd ever seen. "I told you," George Fox kept saying. "You wouldn't believe me, but I told you." Then the party was over, and she was out on the sidewalk saying goodnight to Grace Talbot, who insisted several times that the evening had been fun, and then she was on her way home. There were no more parties, and she got out of the habit of taking walks. She left her apartment only to buy food, TV dinners, and cheap processed food, easy to prepare and quick to eat. And there were many days when she didn't even do that. Once, having willed herself out on the street and into a corner delicatessen, she had selected her purchases from the shelves in the freezer and placed them near the cash register, when she looked up and found the proprietor smiling into her eyes. He was a soft, stout man in his 60s, with coffee stains on his apron, and in none of the times she'd dealt with him before had he ever smiled like that or even spoken to her. "You know something?" he said, as shyly as if he were about to make a declaration of love. "If all my customers were like you, my life would be a great deal happier." "Hmm?" she said. "Why's that?" "Because you help yourself," he said. "You pick everything out for yourself and you bring it up here. That's wonderful. Most people, especially the women, come in here and say, 'Box of Wheaties.' I go all the way to the back where the cereal's kept, bring it all the way back up, and they say, 'Oh, I forgot, a box of Rice Krispies too.' So for 39 cents, I'm getting a heart attack. Not you. Not you ever. You're a pleasure to do business with." "Well," she said, "thank you," and her fingers trembled as she counted out the dollar bills. It was the first time in nearly a week that she'd heard the sound of her own voice, and it had been much, much longer than that since anyone had said something nice to her. Several times she started to dial the number for Mental Health Information Service, but couldn't make herself complete the call. Then once she did complete it, and was referred to another number, at which a number with a heavy Spanish accent, speaking carefully, explained the procedure. Emily could go to Bellevue Hospital any weekday morning before 10. Go down to the basement level and look for a sign reading "Walk-in Clinic." There she would be interviewed by a social worker, and an appointment with a psychiatrist would be arranged for her at a later date. "Thank you very much," Emily said, but she never went. The prospect of going down into the bowels of Bellevue in search of the walk-in clinic seemed almost as bereft of hope as that of walking into Trudy's studio. One afternoon, she was returning from a long walk to the village that she'd forced herself to take, a visit seething with memories of the dead, when she came to a stop on the sidewalk and felt her blood quicken with the beginnings of a new idea. She hurried home then, and when she was alone behind her locked door, she dragged a heavy, dusty cardboard box out of its storage place and into the middle of the floor. It was a box of old letters. She had never been able to throw a letter away, and she went through many thick handfuls of shifting, sliding envelopes, all of them hopelessly out of chronological order, before she found one of the two she was looking for. "Mr. and Mrs. Martin S. Gregory have the honor to announce the marriage of their daughter, Carol Elizabeth, to Reverend Peter J. Wilson on Friday the 11th of October, 1969, St. John's Church, Edwardstown, New Hampshire. She remembered being slightly hurt at not having been invited to the wedding. But Howard had said, "Oh, that's silly. Nobody gives big fancy weddings anymore." She had sent an expensive silver gift and received a nice, touchingly young-sounding note of thanks from Peter's bride, written in a bold little private school hand, and took what seemed hours to find the second item, which was a good deal more recent. The Reverend and Mrs. Peter J. Wilson announced the birth of a daughter, Sarah Jane, 7 pounds, 6 ounces, December 3rd, 1970. "Oh, look, Howard," she had said. "They named her after Sarah. Isn't that nice?" He said, "very nice." But now that she had the 2 announcements, she wasn't certain what to do with them. To hide the uncertainty from herself, she spent a long time cleaning up the spilled, strewn letters on the floor and stuffing them back into the box, which she heaved and skidded back into the shadows where it belonged. Then she washed the dust off her hands and sat quiet with a cold can of beer, trying to think. It was 4 or 5 days before she worked up the courage to place a person-to-person calls to Reverend Peter J. Wilson in Edwardstown, New Hampshire. "Aunt Emmy," he said. "Wow, it's good to hear from you. How have you been?" "Oh, I've been all right, thanks. And how are all of you? How's the little girl?" And they went on that way, talking of nothing at all, until he said, "You still at the advertising agency?" "No, I haven't been doing that for some time. Actually, I'm not working at all now." She was keenly aware of having said "actually" twice, and it made her bite her lip. "I'm just sort of living alone now, and I've got a lot of time on my hands, which I guess is why—" She tried a little laugh, "which I guess is why I just decided to call you up out of the blue." "Well, great," he said. And the way he said "great" made it clear that he'd understood what just sort of living alone now meant. "That's great. You ever get up this way?" "What's that?" "Do you ever get up this way? New England? New Hampshire? Because, we'd love to see you. Carol's always wanted to meet you. Maybe you could come up for a weekend or something." "Wait, listen. I've got an idea. How about next weekend?" "Oh, Peter." Her heart was beating rapidly. "Now it sounds like I've invited myself." No, he insisted. "Don't be silly. It doesn't sound like that at all. Listen, we've got plenty of room. You'd be perfectly comfortable, and it doesn't have to be just for the weekend either. You can stay as long as you like." It was arranged. She would ride up to Edwardstown on the bus the following Friday. It was a 6-hour trip with an hour's layover in Boston, and Peter would meet her at the station. For the next few days, she moved with a new authority, a sense of herself as someone important, someone to be reckoned with, someone to love. Clothes were a problem. She had so few that were suitable for New England in the spring that she toyed with the idea of buying more. But that was silly. She couldn't afford it. On the night before her journey, she stayed up late to wash out all her underwear and pantyhose under the weak yellow light of the bathroom. The landlord had economized by installing 25-watt bulbs in all the bathrooms. And after that, she couldn't sleep. She was still frazzled with the lack of sleep when she carried her small suitcase into the raucous labyrinth of the Port Authority bus terminal early Friday morning. She had thought she might sleep on the bus, but for a long time all she could do was smoke many cigarettes and stare through her blue-tinted window at the passing landscape. It was a brilliant April day. Then a spasm of sleep took her by surprise in the early afternoon. She awoke with a cramp in one arm, with her dress badly wrinkled, and her eyeballs feeling as if they'd been sprinkled with sand. The bus was only a few minutes from Edwardstown. Peter's greeting was enthusiastic. He grabbed up her suitcase as if the sight of her carrying such a load offended him, and led her off toward his car. It was a pleasure to walk beside him. He moved in an easy, athletic stride and held her elbow with his free hand. He was wearing his clerical collar. She thought he must be a very high church Episcopalian if he wore it all the time, with a rather natty light gray suit. "The country's beautiful up here," he said as he drove, "and you really picked a beautiful day to arrive." It's lovely," It certainly was nice of you to ask me. It was nice of you to come. Is your house far from here? Only a few miles. And after a while, he said, You know something, Emmy? I thought of you often since this women's movement began. You've always struck me as the original liberated woman. Liberated from what? Well, from all the old, outmoded sociological concepts of what a woman's role should be. Jesus, Peter, I hope you do better than that in your sermons. Better than what? Using phrases like outmoded sociological concepts. What are you, one of those hip priests? Oh, I guess I'm fairly hip, yes. You have to be if you're working with young people. How old are you now, Peter? 28, 29? You are out of touch, Aunt Emmy. I'm 31. And how old is your daughter? Going on 4. I was very pleased, she said, that you and your wife named your daughter after your mother. Good, he said, pulling out into the passing lane to overtake a fuel truck. When he'd drawn back into the driving lane, he said, I'm glad you were pleased. And I'll tell you what, we're hoping for a boy next time, but if we have another girl, we might name her after you. What would you think of that? Well, that would be very... But she couldn't finish the sentence because she was collapsed and crying against the passenger's door, hiding her face with both hands. Aunt Emmy? He inquired shyly. Aunt Emmy, you okay? This was humiliating. She hadn't been with him 10 minutes, and already she had let him see her cry. I'm fine, she said as soon as she could speak. I'm just tired, is all. I didn't get much sleep last night. Well, you'll sleep tonight. The air is very thin and very pure up here. People say it makes them sleep like the dead. And she busied herself with lighting a cigarette, the ritual she had relied on all her life to restore an illusion of composure. My mother used to have trouble sleeping, he said. I remember when we were kids, we were always saying, Be quiet, Mom's trying to sleep. Yes, Emily said, I know she had trouble sleeping. She was keenly tempted to say, How did she die? But she controlled herself. Instead, she said, What's your wife like, Peter? Well, you'll meet her soon enough. You'll get to know her. Is she pretty? Oh, wow, is she ever. She's beautiful. I guess like most men, I've always had fantasies of beautiful women, but this girl's a fantasy come to life. Wait till you meet her. Wait till you see her. All right, I'll wait. And what do, the two of you? Do you just sit around talking about Jesus all the time? Do we what? Do you stay up late talking about Jesus and resurrection and stuff like that? He glanced briefly out at her, looking puzzled. I don't see what you're getting at. I'm only trying to get some picture of the way you spend your time with your fantasy come to life. She could hear hysteria rising in her voice. She rolled down the partly opened window and snapped her cigarette away into the windstream. And all at once she felt strong and exhilarated, the way she'd felt in confronting Tony. So all right, Mr. Wonderful, she said, let's come clean. How did she die? I don't even know what Peter, your father used to beat your mother all the time. That's a thing I happen to know, and I know you know it too. She told me all 3 of you boys knew it. Don't lie to me. How did she die? My mother died of a liver ailment, complicated by a fall she took in the house. Oh, I've heard that song and dance before. You kids must have really memorized that line. Well, it's the fall I want to hear about. How did she fall? How was she hurt? I wasn't there, Aunt Emmy. Christ, what a cop-out. You weren't there, and you never even asked? Of course I asked. Eric was there. He told me she stumbled over a chair in the living room and struck her head. Do you really think that's enough to kill somebody? It could be, sure, if the person falls badly. All right, tell me about the police investigation. I happen to know there was a police investigation, Peter. There's always an investigation in a case like that. They didn't find anything. There was nothing to find. You sound like some kind of... Why are you grilling me, Aunt Emmy? Because I want to know the truth. Your father is a very brutal man. Trees and neat white houses streamed past the car window, with a blue-green range of mountains high in the distance, and Peter took his time in answering her. So much time that she began to be afraid he was looking for a place to turn the car around so he could drive her back to the bus station and send her home. "He's a limited man," he said at last, speaking carefully, "and in many ways an ignorant man, but I wouldn't call him brutal." "Brutal," she insisted, trembling badly now. "He's brutal and stupid, and he killed my sister. He killed her with 25 years of brutality and stupidity and neglect." "Come on, Aunt Emmy, cut it out. My father's always done the best he could. Most people do the best they can. When terrible things happen, there usually isn't anyone to blame." "What's that, for God's sake? Is that something you learned in your seminary, along with turn the other cheek?" He had slowed down and signaled to make a turn, and now she saw a short concrete driveway, a neat lawn, and a small two-story house of exactly the kind she had imagined. They were here. The inside of the garage, where he brought the car to a stop, was tidier than most people's garages. Leaning against the wall were two bicycles, one with a padded baby seat attached behind its saddle. "So you bicycle," she called to him across the top of the car. She had gotten out quickly, still trembling, and snatched her suitcase from the back seat. Then, because a good loud sound was needed to punctuate her rage, she slammed the car door with all her strength. "That's what you do." Oh, and what a lovely sight it must be. The two of you out bicycling with little what's-her-name on a Sunday afternoon, all tanned and leggy in your sexy little cut-off jeans. You must be the envy of all New Hampshire. She had started around the back of the car to join him, but he was only standing there and looking at her, blinking. "And then you come home and take showers. Do you take showers together? And maybe you play a little grab-ass in the kitchen while you're fixing drinks, and then you have dinner and put the baby to bed and sit around talking about Jesus and resurrection for a while. And then comes the main event of the day, right? You and your wife go into the bedroom and shut the door, and you help each other take off all your clothes, and then, oh, Lord God, talk about fantasies coming to life." "Aunt Emmy," he said, "that's out of line." Out of line. Breathing hard, with her jaws clenched tight, she carried her suitcase down the driveway toward the street. She didn't know where she was going, and she knew she looked ridiculous, but it was impossible to walk in any other direction. At the foot of the driveway, she stopped, not looking back, and after a while she heard a jingle of pocketed coins or keys and a rubber-heeled tread. He was coming down to get her. She turned around. "Oh, Peter, I'm sorry," she said, not quite looking at him. I can't tell you how sorry I am." He seemed very embarrassed. "You don't have to apologize," he said, taking the suitcase from her hand. "I think you're probably very tired and need some rest." He was looking at her in a detached, speculative way now, more like an alert young psychiatrist than a priest. "Yes, I'm tired," she said. "And do you know a funny thing? I'm almost 50 years old, and I've never understood anything in my whole life." "All right," he said quietly. "All right, Aunt Emmy. Now, would you like to come on in and meet my family?"